there are a lot of labels floating out there, libertarian leaning Republican, constitutional conservative, Tea Party, deplorable. I'll go with any of those labels. I don't really get caught up in labels. Look, I've been called a redneck and a hillbilly and a nerd and a geek. I find those to be terms of endearment now instead of derision. This is the Shire. I mean, look at it. It can't get any more beautiful than this. Here in these hills, these are the people that I grew up with, and the families that I grew up with are the same families my kids are growing up with. And to come back here and have real interaction with people and you're going to know until you die, is very rejuvenating to me. My philosophy is live and let live. And I think it comes from growing up here in Eastern Kentucky, where sort of the motto is, you don't worry about what somebody's doing in their holler if they don't worry about what you're doing in your holler. And that comes from the people who settled these hills. They learned to be self-sufficient, and they learned not to poke their nose in their neighbor's business. I was bored growing up, but I found that I liked to build things and make things, especially things that would improve other people's lives. When I was in junior high, I invented a flower pot that would water itself when the soil got too dry. And that was for my grandmother, who liked to travel a lot, and she wanted to make sure her plants didn't die when she was gone. Now, she was paying my brother and my sister to water her plants when she was gone, and I decided to liberate them from their paycheck and invent a self-watering flower pot. Water is life. So a lot of what I'm doing here on my farm is managing water everywhere. Out in front of my house, we're on a hill here, I built this terraced garden, and the water runs off the roof, and we get a lot of water. All that water off my roof comes down here and waters the garden. So it produces lush tomatoes every year. That's going to be yummy on a BLT. Some of these are rotten. These are going to go to the chickens. Chicken's going to eat that. We don't compost because basically everything we produce, the chickens or the dogs will eat. So we don't really have to compost things. Looks like we had 2 eggs. That was still warm. So there's a couple levels of farming. You can buy the offspring after they're hatched or born, but really the next level is when you start breeding your own stock. These chicks were raised right on the nest with the mother, and the benefit of that is we never have to bring them inside and put a heat lamp on them or feed them. They've never been fed little chickie food. They just come out here and eat whatever their mama's eating, which today happens to be tomatoes and bugs. And it seems like a miracle every day that I come out here and there's still 7 chicks, because there are predators right off in the weeds here. There are raccoons, there are foxes, there are coyotes, there are the neighbor's dogs, and all of them like to eat chicken. I like to say the reason so many things taste like chicken is that everything likes the taste of chicken. My dream was to go to MIT. I'd never even visited the campus. I read about this place called MIT. Never been really north of the Mason-Dixon line. And I applied and was accepted. I did well at MIT. It was like drinking from a fire hose. At MIT, I invented some technology, some virtual reality technology that let people touch virtual objects, to feel them with their hands inside the computer. I commercialized this device. I got patents for it. I raised venture capital money. A lot of this happened while I was still in school. My high school sweetheart, who actually grew up on this farm, also went to MIT. So we were doing this company together while we were both students at MIT. That was very rewarding, but my wife and I wanted to get back to Kentucky. And because we had started the company in our married student housing dormitory, we had hired 70 people in New England. I thought about trying to offer them all 40 acres and a mule to come back to Kentucky with us, but ultimately we had to sell our ownership and separate from the company in order for us to relocate here in Kentucky, where we wanted to raise our kids the same way we had been raised. We bought the farm that my wife grew up on. Her parents still live here. And we decided to build a house and to do tangible things. I had been living in virtual reality. That was my business, a virtual reality device. Getting back to the earth and was important to both my wife and I. So we wanted everything about our house to be real and nothing about it to be fake. Kentucky was the best place for us to live this dream because there are very few regulations here. I came back here just to blend in. I didn't want to be the nail sticking up. Shortly after coming back here and starting to build our house with everything real, the local government decided they wanted to start passing more laws and restricting what you could do with your land. I thought, well, I can just ignore that and just go on with my life. And I did. I ignored it for 2 or 3 years. And then I just couldn't take it anymore. And I wrote a letter to the editor to air my grievances with the local government. They were going to raise our taxes that day, and we stopped it from happening. All right, so on my farm, there are some very large stones like this, and they're great building material, but they're too big for me to manage. So what I do is I slice them up using a gas chop saw and wedges to split the stones. So this is a stone where I've sliced into it with the saw and then drove wedges into it and split it. Eventually, I get down to something about this size, but that's not a nice looking face, so I want it to look good. So I face this with the chisel. So my idea for my house was to build it all from stone and timber that I could find here on my farm. And when I told people that I was going to do that, they were worried for me that the stones wouldn't be good enough, that somehow because they were available right here on my farm and local, that maybe they were inferior. And I'm sure you've seen stones that look like this. This is how they end up looking like this. And when they try to imitate stones that look like this, they're trying to imitate work, because this is a lot of hard work. But I think there's this notion that if something's available locally, it's not as good, that it's got to be exotic, that you've got to get this stone from Italy in order for it to be something meaningful. For me, it's more meaningful because it came from the location where I'm building the house. Literally, I want a house that's coming out of the ground and belongs here. That's the other thing. The stones on my house match the stones that we're walking on in the ground here, because it's the same stone. And it's going to last pretty much forever. We had an ice storm that struck our farm in 2003 and fell a lot of trees on our property. I spent a year with my bulldozer and a winch going into the woods and dragging these trees out. And those are the trees that are here in my house, the ones that nature cut down for me. I just had to drag them to my sawmill and then cut them into the shapes that would form this house. I started studying timber framing, and I even signed up for a 1-week class in Tennessee on timber framing. And when I went there, I learned how ignorant I was, and that the beauty of building a timber frame house is that you can make the fasteners out of the same material. The fasteners are wood. The whole house is held together with wooden pegs. But if you study it even more, It's not even the pegs that are holding the house together. There's joinery. The tenons go in the mortises. And then if you lay it out correctly and properly, almost all of the joints are held together just by the force of the house, not by the pegs. So when I found out they were trying to zone the county, that means they wanted to pass a law where we would be required to go to the local government and ask their permission to do things with our property. I decided to write another one of my letters to the editor. 30 people showed up at that zoning meeting. Now, I stood up to speak first, and after 5 minutes, the chairwoman advised me that I should sit down, that I was done speaking. I stood at the podium wondering what I would do next, because I certainly didn't want to sit down. A Democrat in the crowd who had been inspired by my letter to the editor to show up at the meeting stood up and told the chairwoman, he can have my 5 minutes. And she said, okay, Mr. Massie, you've got 10 minutes now. And then everybody in attendance stood up, all 30 people, and said, we're giving him our 5 minutes too. That was inspiring to me because those people trusted me to speak for them, and they wanted to hear what else I had to say. And we stopped the county from being zoned. So they nicknamed this group of people Thomas's Angry Mob. Ironically, they weren't angry, and it wasn't a mob. They were informed, and they were organized, and I was helping organize them. And that's when I realized you could be an activist, and you could change government. It's 88 PSI. We have a pond that's 200 feet in elevation above the house. It's back here in the woods, and it's at the head of that holler about a third of a mile away.
You know, when I visited Monticello, I noticed that they had tin roofs over everything, and they were trying to catch every drop of water that hit their roofs and then reuse it. But I also noticed the next hill over from Monticello was much taller than Monticello. Thomas Jefferson could have built a pond on top of that other hill and used gravity to feed it right there to Monticello, and he could have had all the water he wanted at a water pressure that would have just been incredible. But the problem was they didn't have plastic pipe.
I ran 2-inch pipe right here from that pond down to here, and you get like 0.4 psi per foot of elevation. So I have 88 psi of water, and there's almost 500,000 gallons of water in the pond. And as I use it, whenever it rains, it fills back up. So it'll last for maybe 500 years, you know, if you keep the trees off the dam. Because without water, you can't have anything. Water is life. So eventually I was persuaded by the people who were inspired by my letters to the editor. And I ran for this position called County Judge Executive. You have to judge which roads need paved first, which wooden bridges need to be concrete bridges, which dogs need to be caught, which dogs don't need to be caught because the dog catcher worked for me, who would operate the trash routes. These were things you had to judge. It's not government from 30,000 feet like it is in Washington, D.C. You're in the trenches with bayonets and pitchforks trying to settle these issues. I was inspired to go to other counties and talk to groups that had organized.
One of the messages that I try to get across to people who want to get involved in government is that you got to be involved at every level, and that even the water board or the sewer board or the school board has the power to take your property either through taxation or outright condemnation. And that's a very powerful thing. And so you need to either run for that office or be very concerned about who takes that position.
I was building a base that would ultimately persuade me to run for this congressional seat. And that's what happened. is our congressman announced his retirement. And these people that I had gone to and spoke to, because they cared and I cared, they got me elected to Congress. And now I'm in Congress. So I tell people my life, my career started out in virtual reality, then it came back to the farm, and now I'm back in virtual reality in Washington, D.C. Yeah, one of my sons now, he doesn't like working for me, so he went and got a paycheck. He got a job where he gets a paycheck working construction. He's 17. And now he's got the little stub that's got withholding on it. So there's FICA and federal income tax and state income tax. So, until then, I've been paying cash. So I asked him, what do you think now, son? And he showed me his pay stub, and he pointed to the federal withholding. He said, I think I'm paying your salary now, Dad. You work for me. One of the things I regret about my orchard is I didn't label the trees. Like, I thought I would always remember what tree I had planted where. But then I ran for Congress, got elected, and went to D.C., and I forgot what this tree is. So now I've done something to keep from forgetting. I had to come up with the sign that would outlast me. So I figured tombstones are made to outlast people. So I made little tombstones for my trees that tell me, and the person after I die, hopefully that's not too soon, what the tree actually is. And this is a bell of Georgia. It's a white peach. This is the Shire. I mean, look at it. It can't get any more beautiful than this. And it stands in stark contrast to what lies beyond those hills. Eastward is Mordor. And I mean, Washington, D.C. When I go there, there's no greenery like this. Man has tried to create something as magnificent as these hills, but he's failed, really, in D.C. to do that. There's a lot of glitz and glamour in Washington, and I think it's built that way to impress people, to try to convince people something important is going on there. Here, ducky. So Daddy Duck is the white one. He's they don't like me interrupting their food. The white one is the Daddy Duck. The black one is the Mama Duck. He's a meat duck. He's a Pekin duck. And this is a Cayuga duck. And she lays eggs. And my goal was to cross the meat duck with the egg layer so that the offspring would be sort of a dual purpose duck. I learned you don't touch the metal bucket and the duck fence at the same time because you might mispronounce duck. So that solar panel powers this. Now, I can plug I can plug a fence charger into my house. Anything that's running off electricity on the top of this hill is running off solar power, whether it's got its own little solar panel or whether it's running from my house. The electric wire that connects you to the electrical grid is like an umbilical, like in the Matrix. And the government has a lot of control over your life through that one little wire. If you refuse to comply with one of their regulations, the first thing they do is to cut that wire. And typically the first thing you would then do is cry uncle, because try going without electricity for a day or two once you've gotten used to it. One thing that's become apparent to me now that I've been in Washington, D.C., and after having been in the private sector and also every weekend coming back to my farm, is that the folks in Washington, D.C. have no business trying to make decisions about what's most efficient for people back on their farms or back in their businesses. So there are a lot of people that have never been in the country that live in Washington, D.C. and try to make rules for the country and the countryside. Out here, heating with wood is a very inexpensive, practical, renewable way to sustain your household. And in Washington, D.C., the EPA, even without congressional action, has been trying to crack down on wood-burning stoves because they've got this notion somehow that all the trees are going to disappear and that burning wood is a bad way to create heat. Well, you can see over here on my hillside, like literally, even before you get to the real leafy stuff, there's 4 or 5 dead trees right there that will heat my whole house this whole winter, this entire winter. The 4 trees that you can see will provide all the heat that I need. Now, if I don't go cut down those dead trees and burn them in my wood gasifying boiler, they're going to fall down and termites are going to work on them. And instead of producing CO2, now they're going to produce methane, which the environmentalists say is 43 times as worse in terms of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. All right, so this is my boiler room, and this is where all the heat for the house comes in the winter. My children stack wood on these U-boats, and we roll them into the basement, and if we fill up 4 of these U-boats, we've got enough wood to heat our house for a month. So this is a gold mine to me right here. I found a fallen tree across my trail where the wood has already dried out. You put the wood in the boiler, and instead of burning the wood directly, it gets it really hot, turns it into charcoal, drives off the gases like the hydrogen gas and the other hydrocarbon gases, forces them down into a lower chamber where it burns at 1,500 to 2,000 degrees in a ceramic chamber. And literally everything burns in that chamber. And the benefit is all of the smoke is combusted in that chamber, as well as the things that normally burn. So all that comes out of my chimney is steam. At our house, we're producing less pollution by burning dry wood, and it's also a carbon zero cycle. In other words, all of the carbon that's in this wood was collected from the atmosphere, so that when we readmit it into the atmosphere, there's net zero carbon production. Is that the solution for everybody? No, it's not the solution for everybody. But every solution needs to be tuned to the local environment and the local culture. And that's why it's so wrong for Washington, D.C. to try and dictate that. Our founding fathers didn't want that executive in Washington, D.C. to make all the local decisions. So, we've got levels of government, state government, county government, city government. And a dangerous trend that I see this in Congress, is that that vertical limitation is now being eroded. Horizontally, they balance the power of the judiciary and the legislative and the executive branch. And we've sort of forgotten that. Every time we see the presidential election, we think it's the Super Bowl of politics, and we're electing a king, right? And that the legislative branch and the judicial branch would be irrelevant. The king will just use his pen and his phone and do what he wants. But so we've forgotten that. People are as guilty as the media and anybody else, and remembering that government is horizontally limited, but they are also guilty of forgetting that it's vertically limited. And Washington, D.C. is making decisions that should be made at the state, should be made at the county level. Maybe they should be made in your living room and not made by any government. But we need to always be working to keep that government in check, because it's a dangerous thing, and I've learned it at the county level. So my cattle are on the other side of the creek there in the distance, and we're going to move them over here because the grass has had time to recover here, and it's grown tall enough for them to eat. Some people say that cattle are bad for the environment and that you shouldn't eat beef because more productive things could be done with the land. And those people really have never seen a farm in Appalachia, because look at this field right here, this terrain. Most sane people would not drive a lawnmower on it. It's a hill, right? You can't grow any kind of crop here effectively. Some days in Washington, D.C., I feel like this little white calf here. I look around and say, how'd I get here? What am I doing here? Do I belong here? The farm has taught me how to be more patient, and that's the greatest resource I think you have to have in Washington, D.C. These cattle here, the genetics are the result of 3 or 4 generations of breeding. And I've got mama cows that have calves on their own without a lot of problems. But you can't expect all of that in 1 year or 2 years. Making food for other people and watching them eat it and it provide nourishment to their bodies, that's honest. That's not fake. And something got done and somebody appreciates you for it. And those are concepts that are somewhat foreign in Washington, D.C. I mean, if you think about it, nothing is produced in Washington, D.C. There's nothing manufactured. There's no food grown. There are very few inventions created, if you will. It's just a place where nothing is created, and a farm is exactly the opposite. There's life happening here every day. I've found out that I can get more money for my animals if I keep feeding them grass, get the calves to an older age, and then sell that beef directly to consumers. Now, there are government barriers to that, as you can imagine. And the big players in the beef industry don't want any of those barriers removed. So the USDA rules require you to employ a USDA inspector in your facility full time if you want to have the USDA certification. And there's a butcher house 3 miles from here, 3 miles from my house, that does a fantastic job on these animals. And as long as I sell you a share of this animal before I take it to that butcher shop, it's all legal and you can have the meat after it's butchered. But I can't sell you less than a quarter of the animal. And it's healthy, and the U.S. government has no problem with that. But if I try to sell you a steak, and we don't pretend at least that you own this animal before I butcher it, I go to jail. And the big guys like that, because you can imagine how hard it is if I come up to you and say, would you like to buy some of my beef? And you say, yes, I'm having a cookout this weekend. I say, great, the smallest order is 300 pounds. But you can go to the supermarket and buy one steak because that has the imprimatur of the USDA, because that facility employed a USDA person and kept them at their facility when they were butchering. So the net result of that regulation is, instead of going 3 miles from my house, I have to go 150 miles from my house to a facility that has a USDA inspector, which raises the price and the effort. And then I've got to come 150 miles back with frozen beef without letting it fall, and then distribute frozen beef to consumers. It's a very difficult proposition. Democrats and liberals want the ability to buy locally and consume healthy food, and they're starting to wake up and realize that the healthiest food comes from your neighbor where there's accountability. It doesn't come from some centralized industrial food production system that's corporate. And this is what we're going to be eating, beef brisket. You cook this low and slow.
Sweet.
So for me, I like the fact that it's, quote, green, to be off the grid or to be running on solar power. But for me, it was about independence. Sunlight hits the panels. Panels produce DC electricity. These devices take that DC electricity, step it down, and charge the batteries. Now we've got DC power, but we need AC power to run common everyday appliances in the house. That's what these puppies do. These are inverters. They take 48 volts from the batteries and produce 120 volts AC, alternating current, the kind like your blender wants to use or your air conditioner. And that's what these components do. The thing that's going to be the next breakthrough in energy production is actually energy storage. The world doesn't need a better solar panel. The world doesn't need a better windmill. The world needs a better battery. So next to the big Tesla, we've got the little Tesla here. This is an electric go-kart that my son built, and we charge it with the solar panels, and then, you know, in a zombie apocalypse, when the zombies take over the refineries and they're shut down, we'll be able not only to drive a car off of the solar power from the house, but we'll be able to also have a go-kart. When I started farming this property, I thought about my mission statement. So my mission statement, my mission in life on this farm, my goals for this farm, is to come up with a sustainable, money-producing model. That's why I have cattle on this farm. I don't need 50,000 pounds of beef. That part of it's not a hobby farm. That part of it is figuring out a business model that the next generation can use, whether it's my children or somebody else's children. I don't want to see all of the trees stripped at once and it logged. I would like it to remain very much like it is now. Here's the thing about the hobbits that go to Mordor. Most of them succumb to the intoxication of power. In fact, I've got my precious here with me. This is my congressional pin. And I usually just keep it in my pocket where I can reach in and feel it. It gives me some comfort, but I try not to ever wear it more than I have to. Because when you wear precious, and every congressman has one of these, and they love to wear them, you become intoxicated. And it's the subtle things that you don't even realize that are happening when you're wearing this pin. For instance, the Capitol Hill police get out of your way as you walk toward them. I once bumped into a policeman because I didn't have precious on, and he didn't yield to me. And it's those subtle things, like when you get in an elevator with 10 people on Capitol Hill and they look down and see you're wearing precious, they all quit speaking. You know, they'll hold the door open and let you exit first. When you're walking down the hallway wearing precious, people won't make eye contact. They'll look away and look down when you're wearing precious. And all of those things, as odd as it may seem, make the hobbits who wear precious feel powerful. And I can feel it myself. And it's a scary feeling because I know if I wear this for too long, it's going to affect me, and not in good ways. I think one of my weaknesses and one of my strengths is that I'm a romantic. My dream is not to be a politician. My dream, I'm living it here on my farm already, and that is marrying my high school sweetheart, building our small castle with our own resources on top of a hill. This is actually the farm my wife grew up on. And to be raising a family here and teaching them values like self-sufficiency, that's my dream. My dream is not to lord over people from a central government somewhere. And I get to live that dream one day a week while I'm serving in Congress 6 days a week. And that's important to me. It's been long years since I left my home and the holler where I was born, where the cool fall brings Texas and fox I fell in love with her. I thought that should be true. I ran away to Charlotte and we're in a song with you. What that